let's get started with our sourdough bread. Okay, so in your handout, so to make sourdough bread, you have to have a starter. And the first page, really the second page, the first page is all about why we want to ferment. There's some more research there that I can get a chance to talk about. The next page is our recipes. And then the next page sort of talks about the science behind sourdough, if you're interested in learning more about that. When I understood why I needed to eat sourdough bread, I took an online course, an e-course, all about sourdough. And this is some of the, I got permission from the author to share some of this information with you guys so that y'all can understand what's going on when you're eating sourdough bread. Okay. And then there's another couple pages here that show how to create your own starter. Okay. Everybody that wants to make sourdough bread, you have to have a starter. And what a starter is it's a colony of wild yeast. So we talked about in our other bread class that when you're making a regular yeast bread, it's one strain of yeast. It's become a commercial strain of yeast that they grow this one strain. It's very predictable. It always reacts at 100 to 110 degrees. It makes the same kind of bread every time you work with it. Okay? Sourdough bread is different. You can go look at the bread I have on the table over there, and there's nothing that looks the same. They're all ugly because they're all different. But sourdough bread has a starter, and the starter is, when I made my starter about 8 years ago, you basically take a jar, and you fill it with wheat and warm water, and you leave it open somewhere, and you're going to catch the wild yeast from the air. So the sourdough bread has wild yeast that it's caught from the air. And it's the process of that yeast breaking down over an 8 to 12 hour period that puts off gases that makes your bread rise. All right? So I saved you guys the trouble of trying to grow a starter by bringing starter tonight. All right? And if you guys want to pick them up on your way out the door, that might be the easiest thing to do. So we'll be sure to get those over there. But this is what, look at that. You can see the little bubbles that it's making. Just a couple minutes about your sourdough starter, because this is like a friend that you're going to have living with you from now on. Welcome them into your home, love them, and embrace them. A couple of words about how to feed it. This is what I keep my sourdough starter in, and it's because I make little and a lot. We make everything sourdough at home. Sourdough pancakes, sourdough cornbread, sourdough cinnamon rolls. Everything we eat, we sour. You will see too at the very back of your packet is a little chart that helps explain about the soaking and sprouting process, because really any nuts, grains, or seeds that you eat should be soaked, sprouted, or soured in some way, or you're going to be ingesting that phytic acid and those enzyme inhibitors that could have a negative impact on your health. If you want to get the most nutrition out of your food, food is medicine, this is the process you want to take if you're going to be eating nuts, grains, or seeds. Okay? Not only to get the phytic acid and the enzyme inhibitors out, but because you're going to increase the vitamin content of your food by doing this process. It's like mushrooms. If you buy mushrooms at the store and you set them in the sun for an hour before you cook them, do you know that you increase the vitamin C content 400%? It's amazing. It's amazing the way God has made everything. So, how to feed your starter. You feed it with equal parts flour and warm water. Alright? So let's say this is 3/4 of a cup of starter. You don't ever want to feed it more than 3 times its current volume. So let's say this is a 1/2 cup to keep the math easy. If I wanted to feed this to the maximum, I could feed it up to a 1.5 cups of warm water and a 1.5 cups of flour. Okay? So if I have a recipe that might need 5 cups, I need to think about that and start feeding it. You only want to feed it about every 12 hours. You can't, like you could feed it more often than that, but you have to give the wild yeast and the bacteria in there a chance to reproduce. And if you're feeding it too much too soon, you'll actually kill them off. So no more than 3 times its volume, and just keep that in consideration when you're taking care of your starter. Now my starter lives on the counter because I use it every day. If you're not the kind of person that's going to be doing this very often, and when I started I didn't. We cooked with it about once a week. You can just feed it. Like when you go home tonight, you don't have to feed these because I fed them all about 3 o'clock. So put them on your counter until tomorrow, and then decide what you're going to do. If you're going to put it in the fridge until you figure out what you're going to tackle first, I would put it into a bigger jar because you can't really feed it in here, and I would double it. So I would put like another half a cup of flour and a half a cup of warm water, and then put it in your fridge. And it can stay in your fridge for 10 to 15 days, and it's good. And you can start to think about what you might want to get into first. So when your starter sits for about 8 hours, it's going to make a liquid on top, and that's called the hooch. And that is a byproduct of the process that's happening where the wild yeast is consuming the carbohydrates in your in your flour. So people that have a blood sugar problem can eat this bread because there's not as many carbohydrates in it. There's not as many sugars in it because the yeast is consuming that in this process. It's beautiful. It's wonderful for us. So does anybody have any questions on how to feed it?
You just stir it, or
you just stir it in there.
White flour? I mean, what flour?
So this was made, that's a great question. This was made with fresh ground organic wheat, right? I recommend you feeding it with wheat if you have access to wheat, because if you want to transition it to a white flour, you kind of want to do that like in stages. If you just did it all at once, it will probably work, but it's really better, it will like it better if you keep feeding it what it's been feeding it and then introduce new foods, like a baby, okay? To treat it like your baby. If you kill your starter and you need more, email me, I'm happy to share, I've always got some, okay?
Okay, so half a cup in the fridge is half cup flour, how much water?
The same part, equal parts.
Equal parts.
Mhm.
How can you tell when it's dead?
It won't make any hooch. The hooch shows that it needs to be fed, and it will smell dead.
Okay,
It won't make any bubbles either.
all right.
When you feed it, you're gonna see this bubble process, and that's showing that it's having byproducts. And if you don't see anything, if you put it in there and it hasn't changed at all within 8 hours, it might be dead.
the wheat flour, can you get it from the store? or-
Yeah. So we grind our own wheat fresh. This is my wheat grinder, and we do have information from the last class. We covered that more in depth about why we use the fresh flour and the fresh organic wheat flour. We use organic wheat because of the desiccation process, because you get so much Roundup when you eat regular wheat that people don't even know. And a lot of the people that think that they're gluten intolerant are actually having a reaction to the glyphosate that they're spraying on it right before they harvest it. So I really encourage you to get organic wheat anytime you can. You can get organic HEB brand wheat at our grocery store. Bless them for having that. If you don't like wheat flour, you can use white flour. Whatever your preferences are. So,
So when you see this hooch on the top, that means
Okay.
you feed it?
yes. And so you want to pour that hooch off.
Oh, okay.
Just pour the hooch off and then feed it. If you leave the hooch in there, then you're going to have too much liquid and not enough flour. Like, you can, but really it's better just to pour the hooch off because it's a byproduct. So, there was one more thing I was going to... Okay, sometimes when I've kept this in here for a couple months now. Every once in a while, when it's sitting on my counter, it'll pick up a different kind of bacteria that I don't want in there. And it will start at the top, it'll start to get black, or it'll start to have an off smell. That means that you've got something in there that you probably don't want growing. And so just pour it into a clean container and keep going. So every once in a while, you may have to give them a bath and put them in a new container. But it happens to me like maybe once a year, maybe twice a year. There's nothing wrong with it. One of the most beautiful things about fermented foods is that nobody has ever died from eating fermented foods. I'm serious.
Good to know. That's what I was always afraid of.
Let me say, because I took the canning class at the ag office here in town, and they scared the bejesus out of me because of botulism. Because botulism is tasteless, odorless, and you don't know you have it until it kills you. And it's like, I will never buy canned goods from anybody at any farmer's market ever again because it is so dangerous if you don't follow the proper procedures. Fermented foods is different because you have your 5 senses. Your sight, your smell, your touch. If there's something wrong, it will feel slimy. If there's something wrong, it will smell off. It'll smell terrible. Okay, you can't smell this right now. You might smell a sour smell. You will know if something has happened and it's changed because it will smell terrible. It will taste terrible. And your body will tell you, don't eat that. And the great thing about our ancestors that discovered all these fermentation processes, They were so in tune with their bodies and their environment, so much more than we are nowadays. We have so lost that. And I hope everybody goes home to their grandmother's boxes of stuff in your attic and digs out her recipes, because those people had it right. And we have lost the ability to be in touch with our bodies and to know these people just did stuff and they said, hey, I feel better when I eat that. Look, our food is lasting us through the winter. We don't have to go kill a squirrel to eat. And so these people knew what to do to survive. They knew it made them feel good. They were healthier. Bless their elderly people. They got to live the end of their life at home with their families and not in nursing homes where it takes a full-time medical staff to support all the chronic health problems that they have. That's what we're trying to get back to. Those people knew a lot, and we've lost that, and it's so sad, and we need to get back there. So, all right, so to make sourdough bread, you've got your sourdough starter, and I'm going to show you guys what I do when I make this bread. Now, it took me years to figure out how to do this, and you could do the exact same thing. These two loaves had the exact same ingredients, but it was the method that made all the difference. Exact same ingredients. This is what we call a brick. This is the first several years, and you could literally like pound a hammer with this thing. This becomes breadcrumbs in our house. This becomes what we make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches out of. All right? So I encourage you to follow the recipe as closely as possible, because this is what I have found works. And the reason I did this is because I took my current recipe and I was like, well, what if I let it sit on my counter for this many hours instead of this many hours? And this is what happens. And I said, oh yeah, okay, well I'll just go back to doing it the way I was doing it. So I feed about what I need to take out. So my recipe calls for 2 cups of starter. So when I'm getting ready to cook, I'm only going to do 1 cup this time because I have a lot of starter in here. I usually have about half of this starter is what you guys see. So just a cup of wheat and a cup of starter. Or if I had, like, normally I'm like down here, so I'll put 2 cups of each in there, just so you guys know. And just so you can see the consistency when you're stirring it. It's kind of like really thick,
Batter.
yeah, like pancake batter.
You don't have to wait, you don't have to,
Oh,
that's not feeding.
Nope. This is feeding. This is the same feeding process.
But your bread
Stir
recipe shows
Stir
2
it.
cups of starter
That's
to
right.
5 cups of flour.
Okay, so
You didn't do that.
well, we have 2 cups of starter here. What I was saying, normally I only start with about this much, so I'll feed it 2 cups of flour and 2 cups of water. And then by the time it's done, there's a volume of about 3.5 cups. Does that make sense? Because this is the tricky part that really took me a long time to master when I was learning how to make sourdough. When I'm getting ready to cook, I make sure whatever I have, I can feed 2 cups. So you could go home and feed this 2 cups, probably. There's about enough there to feed it 2 cups. But what you don't want to do is feed it and then have to use all of it in your recipe, because then you won't have any left over to keep going.
Well,
So
I guess I'm just talking about this recipe here. It says 2 cups of starter and 5 cups of flour.
yeah, we'll get there.
Okay,
We'll get there. So if you wanted to make this bread recipe at home, I would go home and probably feed this 1 time before I started making bread. I would double this and then start making the bread. So you have to get to where you have 2 cups of flour, 2 cups of starter in some form or fashion.
Okay.
So I'm going to pour this in my bowl, and don't worry about all this stuff on the side.
It's a lot of starter.
It is a lot of starter, but trust me, this recipe works. It will make bread that looks like this. And I have tried literally, I can't tell you how many hundreds of recipes I have tried. 2.5 cups of water, warm water, like warm out of the tap. You don't have to measure temperatures. Okay. A tablespoon of salt. Now the salt does 2 things. Your salt is your leavener, so it's going to help it rise. And your salt is also creating a perfect environment for the yeast to grow. It's the same thing with making sauerkraut. Sauerkraut, the salt is the only thing you're going to use to help that yeast grow. And then we're going to do 5 cups of flour. than a yeast dough. So are you good on that? You understand the ingredients?
I do now.
Okay. And that's why, sorry, you really have to see it because it's just so hard to understand.
Well, plus I didn't read after the ingredients. It
And that,
says-
when I was starting, it was really hard for me to understand because I never knew, like, well, was I supposed to use 2 cups that I had like fed 8 hours ago and then use that? And it took me a really long time to get, and I'm very much wound up with my recipe by trial and error right now. And so I still am trying to play with it, and that's why I wound up with this a couple weeks ago because I'm still trying to mess with it and I need to stop.
But
So-
isn't it gonna sit on the counter for a while and keep
Yes.
fermenting?
Okay, so this is what it's gonna look like. It's gonna look like a wet, soggy, and you're gonna be like, how is that gonna turn into bread? So we leave this on the counter for about an hour, okay? And then you're gonna come back and you're gonna stir it. And it's gonna start to look like this, okay? This is a little bit too soggy right now for me to show you guys how to stir it or knead it. I don't know how to call it because it's not kneading like you would think. But after the first hour, I'll come by about every 30 minutes and I'll give it a stir, okay? When it's still soggy like this, I might just stir it. You're not trying to over stir it. You only want to.
What's it doing while you're stirring? Is it rising?
It's just you're giving
What is it
those.
doing?
You're giving that bacteria a chance to eat. It's consuming the carbohydrates in the wheat, and it's growing and colonizing.
Okay.
Okay, and it's that process that is putting off gas bubbles, and that's what's going to help your bread rise.
All right.
Okay, so after it's been sitting on the counter for a while, it's going to start to look like this. You can see how it's come up in volume
See all
from
those
this
bubbles?
soggy mash here. Okay, so when I am going to stir this, when I'm going to knead this, and you'll see this in your handout, what you're going to want to do, start at one side, reach your spoon down there, pull from the outside into the middle. Turn it 90 degrees, reach your spoon down there, turn to the middle. I don't know how best to describe this other than showing you guys. But turn to the middle.
Holding.
One more time. Folding is probably the best way to call it. Thank you. And it's going to be sticky and you're going to think, how is that going to make bread? You're going to do that about 4 times. About after the first hour, about every 30 minutes. So from start to finish, it's going to sit on your counter about 3 hours. I'm not a slave to the clock. I usually walk by and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm making bread. And so don't worry about the time. Don't worry about how often it's been that you've folded it. After that 3 hours, you're going to want to put it in the fridge. And that's what happens here. I thought, well, maybe I'll leave it on my counter for 8 hours to ferment. And this happened because it's just the way that you control the length of the process that the carbohydrates are breaking down. So I put it in my fridge for at least 8 hours, but I prefer 24 hours just because you give the yeast more time to work.
What's
So
it doing in the fridge?
it is the same process, but slowed down.
Okay.
Okay? So I take it out of the fridge the next day, and I'll take the lid off. I'll do my 4 folds. Okay? I'll put the lid back on. While it's sitting on my counter, I do leave a lid on it because I don't want it drying out. It will get like a film on it, like it'll start to harden and dry out. Kind of like there's a bunch of crusty stuff here. Okay, put the lid back on it. Flip it over.
Here we go.
Here's all the secrets are coming out now. These are my favorite bread pans. This is my best favorite bread pan in the whole world. It came from like an Indian reservation in Arizona or somewhere, and I can't find another one. Myra, if you could order these, it'd be great.
Oh,
You can get them
yeah.
in your store.
Be
You
on the
can sell them
lookout.
like hotcakes because they're fabulous.
This just for her
Sure,
to
yeah.
see.
Yes.
I don't want to pull,
Yeah.
go this way, but no.
But these are what I cook in at home, and you can see they're well loved. Yeah. And spray it first. We make about 20 to 30 loaves of bread a week, so we go through quite a bit. Okay, so right now I have this soggy mess on the lid, and you do this on the lid, otherwise you're gonna have a heck of a mess on your counter. And I, as best as I can, I don't know if you guys can see here, I cut it in half. And it's a soggy, sticky mess. Then I take this thing and throw it in the pan. This one I slide off, because I don't want to touch it. And the last thing I'll do is cut a slit in the middle, which is really hard. And in fact, one of my kids this morning, they were like, why do you do that? Because it just goes back. But it does make a difference. And you can see the bread out there on the table. You can see sometimes the slit goes this way. You can see all the different ways. So a slit down the middle. And what that's going to do is when it's rising, it's just going to force it. You can see here the slit. It's just going to help guide it and direct it, because sourdough is so crazy that you don't know where it's going to go when it starts cooking. I put it in my preheated oven at 350 for 45 minutes with about 6 to 8 ice cubes. And the ice cubes put off a bunch of steam, helps with the rising process, so that you just throw them in the bottom of your oven. Put them in first, because if you put the bread in first and then throw the ice cubes, you always get one in the pan. It's a mess. So that's part of what makes the difference between this and this. Okay? I can't explain everything behind it. I can just tell you this is what we do, and this is what works. Okay? So that's it. Does anybody have any questions about sourdough bread? I know. We talked about a lot.
The starter, that when you make starter originally, it's just flour and water?
Flour and water. But yes, in fact, I talked to somebody who said that they saw somebody, this lady volunteers at Monument Hill, where they used to have the brewery. They saw somebody there bring a cup of starter and leave it. They asked permission if they could leave it there so they could catch the wild yeast from the brewery area.
Oh,
And I was like, oh, that's a fabulous idea. I should totally do that and sell it,
Yeah.
you know. And,
Yeah.
What kind of flour is that?
this is hard red winter wheat.
Okay.
It's organic. I buy the berries, buy the 50-pound bag, and then we grind it ourselves. Okay?
There's a lot more information about the wheat and the bread video that's available on the website. She's having to
Yes,
skip
we
over a
do.
lot of stuff today.
Yeah, just because we have so much to cover in a short amount of time. We use hard red winter wheat. You could also use a white wheat. If you wanted to transition to like an einkorn or a kamut or something else. So when I'm done, when I'm ready just to put this back on my counter, I scrape the sides back down. Just because if you leave everything all up on the sides, it'll dry out and it won't get to be a part of the culture anymore. So this is what I keep it in. This is what I have found works best, because we go through, like, you can have a little or a lot. And like I said, at home, everything we make is soured, so we do use a bunch of it.
And if you do have any other questions that don't get addressed here, if you think of them later, you commented at the site and or on the YouTube video, and we'll get to it as soon as possible.
Yeah, if you get home and you try this and you're like, wait a minute. So, just, any more questions before we move on to sauerkraut? Okay.
So how long does it sit here?
Well, this is ready to go in the oven.
So it's
Like,
ready.
So it rises
Yeah.
in the oven.
Right, yes. So typically if I was at home, my oven would be preheated, and I would throw these in there right now with my 6 to 8 ice cubes, and it would cook in 45 minutes. It would
They
come out.
rise in the oven
They
instead of out of the
rise,
oven?
they rise in the oven.
Okay.
Yep, this is exactly what it looks like when I put it in the oven. And it's like Christmas when I open the oven door every time, because I don't ever know what it's gonna look like, because sourdough is so crazy.
Would you repeat something about the ice cubes?
When I go to put this in my preheated oven, I toss in 6 to 8 ice cubes in the bottom of the oven, and then I put my bread in there and bake it.
Creates a steam.
It creates a steam that helps it rise. Okay, and it is in that recipe there.
Okay.